Thank you for intervention and for your response. That was very enlightening for me, who's not a philosopher. I had, I think, two very silly questions. The first was, during your presentation, I thought a lot about the opposition of the state versus community. You know, community care means caring about the homeless people at your door. State care means about thinking that, oh, there's homeless people, the state will take care of them, or maybe take them away, etc., etc. And it got me thinking about, can a state be a community, and what does it mean on its relationship to violence? And it got me thinking about, what is the state, and can we imagine a state that isn't violent or does not have for a goal to either oppress or regulate violence, which has been its historical role, at least in Western society. And my other very silly question was, everything you said and the way you answered, Amal, I think rested a bit on, what does it mean to blame? To put responsibility on someone for something, including violence. Does it mean does blaming mean we put the person in jail? Does blaming mean the person maybe needs to die, to be taken away? Does the person needs to be cared for, to be helped? What does it mean for the one who puts the blame to have to care for the person, or to have to kill her maybe? And so there was my 2C question, which I'm sure were never the subject of philosophy, which is, what does it mean to blame, and what is the state?
Thank you so much. I was fascinated, but also a little bit intimidated by this concept of militant care. And I was wondering, since care is such an intimate act, should we actually treat or maybe try to deal with violent care like we deal with sexual violence, as questions of consent and maybe will, or I don't know. Yeah, this is the question. Thank you.
I would like to propose something in response to Professor Amal Jamal's response, which of course relates to your discussion. I'm wondering if you said that more policing is not the solution, with which I couldn't agree more. And I'm wondering if we're talking about practical solutions and practical models, if we shouldn't go back to the sometimes cliche answer of education, specifically early age education. Because on a personal and professional level, I work very, very closely with adolescents. And I've seen personally the shift in the last decade when it comes to, in certain sectors, treatment of LGBTQ issues. And that's because there has been, again, only in certain sectors of our society, but in those sectors, there has been an influx of programming that has to do in the education system, flawed as it is, with LGBTQ education and workshops, and some of it starts in preschool, as early as preschool. And you really, really see the difference. That's not to say that all the parents of adolescents in these sectors today would be thrilled if their child came out, but there's a lot more tolerance and a lot less violence surrounding that topic. So of course you can't exactly parallel the two topics, but I'm wondering about the effectiveness of it including this kind of content in an educational model from early education through primary education before you reach the adolescent years.
Okay, so a very fast question as well. Viewing society as a structure in itself gives violence different forms. So I was thinking about viewing society, if viewing society in the metaphor of a network or fabric or strings, does it provoke a different types of problems or solutions? That's the first one. And the second one is about the concept of God. Does it has a place in your God? Yes, God himself. Yes, herself. Yes, themselves. Okay. Does it have a place in your view? Thank you very much.
For me, so the question: can the state be a community, or can there be a state without violence? I mean, this is, of course, really at the center of the question of modern state political philosophy of the state. Yeah? So in the concept of sovereignty as the definition of the state's monopoly on violence would suggest that, or probably there's a near anonymous consensus amongst political philosophers that would say no. Violence, or the monopolization of violence, is essentially a part of the state. But I, along with, I think, anarchist and abolitionist thinkers would say, we have to come up. So if that is a goal that we have, reducing violence and not just countering it, to come up with ways of organizing human living together without coercion. And I think the anarchist hope is that this is possible for humans. And for me, it makes sense to think of this in the democratic tradition, to say that if humans are more involved into making decisions about their collective lives, and they feel they can genuinely participate in these decisions, this will make coercive forms less and less necessary. So that is a radical democratic, this is a very short answer, but could be a way of reducing coercive elements in the law. The question of blame is not so important for me because, and I think also for the abolitionist framework, who's to blame is not so much important because it is a very moral concept. So, and also not so interesting to assign responsibility or guilt or blame to a specific person or group, but rather talk about the social structures that create and recreate violence over and over again. So, and this is again, I think one of the good things that with Wilson Gilmore taught us is to think away from the question of innocence. So the problem is not that innocent people are put into jail. The problem is that people are put into jail. So the question of guilt and innocence is a very moralizing concept that I think maybe is not so useful for the political struggle. So I don't know who's to blame for this violence. I see the problem that it might also lead to a irresponsibilization. If you have no clear agent that you can address, that there is also a problem. But I think if you address certain agents, you have to be sure of the fact that this is only a representation or a figure of a larger problem. So if I struggle against this and that company, this and that policeman, this and that prison, this and that nation state, it's not because there is an inherent guilt, but because they are representations of an underlying structure that needs to be changed, in my view. There's, of course, a larger debate. The question of militant care and if we can deal with it maybe in the same way that we talk about forms of sexualized violence. I have to think about this more, but for me, I would be hesitant of using the term consent for that. Consent for me is a bit at odds with the experience of care. If you talk about it in the phenomenological way. So we are often, for me, consent is a very contractual language. So you have an obligation because you have consented to it. Whereas in our lives, we often have obligations even though we don't consent to it. And this, like coming from also the mothering perspective or the perspective that you have towards animals or the perspective you have towards the globe, all of this, I came to this world and I had obligations, even though I'd never signed any contract. It's simply because the other calls on me in that way. And if I go through the street and I see somebody in need, there's a certain ethical obligation, even though I haven't signed a contract. And I think, therefore, we have to move beyond the concept language and think about maybe what makes us human in that sense, or what makes us able to participate in a society, in a social life. What kind of attitudes do I want to cultivate? What kind of behavior do I want to see, and so on. So I think I like the idea to connect it with forms of sexualized violence and to think about militant care is obviously very hard, but I'm not sure if the term consent is necessary for that. I also don't necessarily think that care is an intimate thing. Of course, we know many relations of care that are personal. So I care for my family, for my friends, for my lover, and so on. So you have but care is also, I think, it's a question of an infrastructure of care. Yeah. So to make sure that everybody is being cared for, everybody is taken care for, even though maybe you don't know that person. And when we talk about care on the global scale, this obviously becomes much more stronger. Yeah? So we care for people that we have never met, that we will never meet, and even for future generations. Yeah? So it's more like making the concept of care less intimate and more political, I think. Yeah? I'm not sure I can say much about education. I think the question of education has played a very big role in the abolitionist struggle in the past and also in liberation struggles altogether. But then we often don't talk about early childhood education that was so important for you. It's more like, educating ourselves about systems of oppression and so on. The Black Panthers had libraries, had self-organized schools and all of this. So I think there is an important element to this. Also to understand education not as something that is a state task, but it's something that is an element of autonomy and self-organization. Yeah, but I don't know if I can say more about the early childhood education, unfortunately. Jad, I mean, yeah, how do you see the society and how does this inform our view of violence? Definitely, it has an impact. Yeah, so if you see, for example, the problem of the violence in the society as the Leviathan, I think that you used this image. Yeah, you have one center, you have a clear aggressor of like the nation state as like a monolithic, homogeneous aggressor. Of course, then you have a certain understanding of what resistance looks like, what violence looks like, and so on. If you see society more as a conglomerate of multiple sources of violence that are also as Gilmore says, state sanctioned and or extra legal. Yeah, so there are many forms of violence that we experience that are not state sanctioned, like patriarchal violence in many cases, like a mob, like lynching, and so on. Economic forms of violence, forms of empowerment, and so on. So I think it's important to have a more broad understanding of what a society is, maybe one that you call a network. God, I don't think so. Sorry. I mean, I think there are many reasons to think about connections of theological discourses with political discourses that I find very productive, like in Benjamin. And I think it is impossible to simply translate Benjamin's text, for example, into a merely political vocabulary and just treat the theological elements as simply like a metaphor or something. Yeah? So I think it needs to be taken serious. Same with other theological influences or cosmological influences, so that are very important for indigenous struggles. And I think that this often that you find left secularism is not the final answer to this. So I want to open my view and my heart to God, but I can't at the moment. I'm sorry. Should I also answer Jamal? Yeah. I mean, you said many interesting things, and I don't want to go through them one by one, but maybe just one or two clarifications or answers. So I don't believe that violence is necessarily part of any form of organizing a human society. So that's maybe, I'm not as pessimistic as you read it. I think it is possible to organize the human society in a at least fundamentally different way. if there's still some form of violence, of course, but I think it is possible to organize human society in a fundamentally different way. But I'm pessimistic about the capacity of the political and economic institutions as they are established now to ever accomplish that and to reform themselves in a way that they could ever accomplish that. Is it pessimistic or optimistic? I mean, I think there are multiple crises that we witness. One of them is the refugee crisis. Last week, we had 700 people drowning on one single ship in the Mediterranean. You have, at the same time, the European Union deciding in a much celebrated compromise to build prisons for refugees at the borders. We will have at least 1 billion climate refugees in the next 10 years. So the question of migration and of refugees will never stop. So that you have two options. Either you let them die, you let them drown, you deport them, you incarcerate them and put them in camps, or you question the model of the nation state more fundamentally. And that for me is, I mean, I simply don't see any other solution. So that means that the reformist or integrationist solution is not a solution. It is a decision for continuation of suffering and violence. And therefore, I really honestly believe that the abolitionist perspective to reconstruct the society from below and find different institutions that are built on different imaginaries, different concepts, and so on, is the only realistic one. Is that pessimistic or optimistic? I don't know. I mean, I think it is pessimistic because I don't see it happening in the future. But it is also optimistic because, you know, that we have more and more, we have numbers. So it's not a marginalized question. It's a question that cannot be marginalized. It is something that will come at the center.
This change come through violence. This is the right answer. Question that doesn't